The year was 1921. America stood triumphant, bloodied but victorious from the Great War. The nation's factories roared, its cities stretched skyward, and a new era of prosperity glittered on the horizon. The country was drunk on progress, flushed with the promise of endless growth, fast cars, and modern conveniences. But beneath the Jazz Age optimism, darker forces stirred. In the marble corridors of Washington, D.C., a quiet shift was underway. The old progressive crusaders who had once championed clean government and public stewardship were giving way to a different breed. Businessmen in politics, politicians in business. And in the smoke-filled back rooms of the Capitol, deals were struck with handshakes and whispered promises. At the center of this new order stood President Warren Harding. Affable and utterly uninterested in the details of governance, Harding surrounded himself with loyalists, many drawn from his Ohio days. They were his poker-playing loyalists, men who believed government should serve the men of enterprise, not burden them with rules. Among them was Albert Fall, the rugged Secretary of the Interior, a man whose weathered face told stories of frontier hardship and ambition. To Fall, the West was a land of riches to be claimed, not coddled. And sitting in the heart of Wyoming, beneath a rock shaped like a teapot, lay the key to his fortune: Teapot Dome. To the public, it was a remote, windswept patch of scrubland, out of sight, out of mind. But below the surface, vast oceans of oil slumbered in ancient rock. Oil that the U.S. Navy considered vital for wartime emergencies. But Fall saw something else. Where the Navy saw security, Fall saw leverage. Where the conservationists saw preservation, he saw profit. And in the shadows, he quietly opened the door to two oil barons, Harry Sinclair, the brash magnate of Mammoth Oil, and Edward Doheny, the California tycoon who had built an empire drilling the black gold of the West. No public auctions, no oversight, just private meetings, sealed envelopes, and handshake deals. It was corruption hidden in plain sight. And for a time, no one noticed. With only 49% of Americans voting in the 1920 election, few cared to question the deals unfolding in Washington. But in the shadows of the Wyoming plains, a small-town oilman noticed the drills, the new derricks, the suspicious speed at which the leases changed hands. Leslie Miller, an unassuming man of principle, began to whisper. His words traveled up the political ladder until they landed in the hands of Senator Thomas Walsh, a soft-spoken Montanan with a prosecutor's patience. What followed would become one of the most explosive scandals in American history, a tale of greed, betrayal, and the selling of the nation's lifeblood to the highest bidder. This is the story of Teapot Dome, a scandal that sparked a reckoning, reshaping the laws that guard a nation's trust, and how it changed everything. It began with oil. In the aftermath of World War I, America stood on the cusp of an energy revolution. Coal had fueled the nation's rise, but the future belonged to oil. The U.S. Navy understood this better than anyone. Their new fleet of battleships, faster and deadlier than their coal-fired predecessors, demanded vast quantities of petroleum to project American strength across the oceans. But oil fields were finite. Foreign supply lines could be severed in times of war. To safeguard against this, the government designated specific oil-rich lands as naval petroleum reserves, emergency stockpiles meant solely for national defense. Among them was a barren patch of Wyoming known as Teapot Dome, named for a curious rock formation shaped like a spout and handle rising from the earth. For years, Teapot Dome sat untouched, untapped. It was insurance, nothing more. But in Washington, appetites were growing. In 1921, Warren Harding rode a wave of post-war exhaustion into the White House. His campaign promised a return to normalcy, stability, business growth, and an end to progressive reform zeal. But Harding's leadership was less about policy and more about personal loyalty. He assembled a cabinet filled with friends and political allies, a group the press would later call the Ohio Gang. Among them was Albert Bacon Fall, a former senator from New Mexico, a weathered Westerner shaped by the harsh New Mexico frontier. Fall had clawed his way up from frontier poverty, His weathered face, drooping mustache, and piercing eyes made him a larger-than-life figure in Washington's polished halls. Appointed Secretary of the Interior, Fall now controlled millions of acres of public land, a portfolio ripe with opportunity. But behind the image of rugged self-reliance, Fall was drowning in debt. His New Mexico ranch was failing. Bank creditors circled like vultures. Desperate for a financial lifeline, Fall began to see the nation's natural resources not as public trusts, but as personal salvation. Traditionally, the naval oil reserves fell under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Navy Department. Officers like Robert Griffin and other Navy officers had fiercely protected these assets, viewing them as critical to national security. They resisted any attempts to commercialize the reserves, fearing that private exploitation would weaken America's strategic position. But Fall was a seasoned operator. He argued that the Navy lacked the resources and expertise to properly manage oil land leases. The Interior Department, he claimed, was better equipped to oversee mineral rights and ensure efficient development. He framed the move as administrative streamlining, a mundane bureaucratic adjustment. Very few in Washington saw through this facade. In May 1921, President Harding, trusting his friend's judgment, signed an executive order transferring control of the Naval Petroleum Reserves, including Teapot Dome, from the Navy to the Interior Department. The shift barely registered in the press. It was, after all, just paperwork. But for Fall, it was the first critical step. At the heart of the brewing scandal was a simple, undeniable fact. Oil was money. In the booming 1920s, as automobiles flooded American roads and industrial production soared, demand for petroleum skyrocketed. By 1923, the United States boasted over 15 million registered automobiles, a staggering increase from just a decade earlier. Gasoline had become the lifeblood of modern America. And where there is demand, there's opportunity. Oil tycoons, men who had risen from obscurity to amass vast fortunes, now eyed the naval reserves with covetous ambition. For them, Teapot Dome represented not just profit, but power. It was during this period that names like Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny entered the narrative. Sinclair, the bold and charismatic head of Mammoth Oil Company, had built an empire through aggressive expansion and political connections. He was known for his lavish lifestyle and his willingness to bend the rules when opportunity knocked. Doheny, founder of Pan American Petroleum, was a self-made millionaire who had struck oil in California and Mexico. Older and more reserved than Sinclair, Doheny's influence was no less formidable. Both men had personal ties to Fall. Both were eager to secure leases on the naval reserves, and both knew that in Harding's Washington, access was often a matter of friendship and favors. Far from the marble corridors of power, the rumblings of discontent began quietly. In Casper, Wyoming, local oilman Leslie Miller noticed unusual activity surrounding Teapot Dome. Rumors of backroom deals and private negotiations trickled through the oil community. Miller, concerned that public resources were being siphoned off for private gain, began to raise questions. His letters to Washington, though initially ignored, planted seeds of suspicion. Miller's quiet whistleblowing would later prove pivotal. His concerns reached Senator John Kendrick, who would carry the torch into the national spotlight. But in these early days, Fall operated without serious scrutiny. By late 1921, Fall had completed his power grab. The naval reserves were his to manage. Publicly, he maintained the veneer of responsible stewardship. Privately, he began to open the floodgates. Handshake deals, quiet meetings, arrangements with Sinclair and Doheny carefully concealed from public view. The mechanisms of corruption were now in motion. What Fall saw as opportunity, history would remember as betrayal. The Teapot Dome Scandal had begun. With Teapot Dome now under the control of the Interior Department, thanks to President Harding's executive order signed in May 1921, Fall saw opportunity in every barrel buried beneath the earth. No longer constrained by military oversight or environmental caution, he was free to act, and Fall did not waste time. The early 1920s were a period of national tension between conservation and resource extraction. Former Progressive era officials like Gifford Pinchot, a leading conservationist, warned of reckless depletion of public lands. Pinchot had championed the view that natural resources were not to be sold off to the highest bidder, but managed for long-term public good. But Fall, a product of the rugged West, saw things differently. He believed resources were meant to be used, not hoarded. His philosophy was rooted in the frontier mindset. The land existed to be claimed, developed, and monetized. Fall began pushing leases of public lands aggressively, including the Elk Hills and other California reserves. But it was Teapot Dome, with its massive, untouched supply, that became his ultimate prize. In December 1921, Fall granted Pan American Petroleum exclusive rights to drill the Elk Hills Reserve in California. The justification was couched in national interest. Doheny would build oil storage tanks for the Navy at Pearl Harbor in exchange, but the lease terms were remarkably generous and no other companies were invited to compete. Later that year, Fall handed over Teapot Dome itself to Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company. Again, no bidding, no oversight. The deals were signed behind locked doors, without press releases or public hearings. Fall used his bureaucratic discretion to bury the paperwork within the Interior Department files, circumventing standard procedures. On paper, the deals appeared legitimate. In practice, they were laced with corruption. Back in Wyoming, oil rigs began to appear almost overnight. Sinclair's engineers wasted no time tapping the dome, laying pipe, and running drills across the landscape. The once quiet reserve, untouched for national defense, now roared to life with private extraction. As the oil began to flow, so did the money. Edward Doheny, shortly after receiving the Elk Hills lease, sent his son Edward Jr. to Washington with a satchel containing $100,000 in cash, delivered directly to Fall's apartment. Officially, it was a loan between old friends, but there were no repayment terms, no interest rate, and the timing was undeniable. Meanwhile, Sinclair offered his own form of gratitude. Over the course of their dealings, Sinclair funneled roughly $300,000 to Fall in various forms. $70,000 in direct cash, $185,000 in Liberty bonds, and the delivery of 1,500 head of cattle to Fall's struggling New Mexico ranch. He even helped cover renovations and repairs on the property, turning the once deteriorating spread into a showpiece. Fall's lifestyle changed rapidly. He purchased new automobiles, upgraded his ranch house, and began entertaining guests with a confidence he hadn't displayed in years. All of it stood in stark contrast to his $6,000 government salary. And it didn't go unnoticed by those who knew his past financial troubles. To the outside world, these transactions remained invisible. Fall kept up appearances, retreating to New Mexico in early 1923 under the pretense of needing rest. Sinclair expanded operations at Teapot Dome. Doheny's contractors broke ground on the Navy's new oil storage tanks in Hawaii. The leases were active, the Navy remained silent, and the public, unaware of the backroom deals, saw nothing unusual in the rising output from the reserves. But the dominoes had been stacked. The fall would come swiftly. In Washington, the wheels of government turned slowly, but they turned. While Fall retreated to his New Mexico ranch, the ground beneath the Teapot Dome scheme began to crack. It started not in the grand chambers of Congress, but in the oil fields of Wyoming. Leslie Miller, the dogged local oilman introduced earlier, wasn't content to let Teapot Dome's quiet handover stand. From his modest office in Casper, he penned letters to political allies, laying out his suspicions. That Secretary Fall had bypassed competitive bidding, locking out smaller operators in favor of select insiders. His claims weren't taken seriously at first. Washington had little interest in the grievances of a provincial businessman. Initially, with only 49% of citizens voting in the 1920 election, few noticed Fall's deals. But Miller's persistence and Walsh's findings ignited a firestorm. But Miller didn't stop. His persistence finally caught the eye of Senator John Kendrick, Wyoming's own representative in the U.S. Senate. Kendrick, a cattleman turned politician, understood the nuances of oil politics in the West. And when he saw the evidence Miller presented, leases granted in secret, terms hidden from the public, he sensed something foul. In April 1922, Kendrick formally introduced a Senate resolution calling for an investigation into the Teapot Dome leases. His action would open the door to the most infamous political scandal of the decade. Assigned to the task was Senator Thomas Walsh of Montana, a soft-spoken, methodical lawyer known for his integrity and meticulous attention to detail. Walsh was no headline seeker. Where others might have blustered, he preferred to build airtight cases brick by brick. Walsh's probe faced fierce resistance. Oil barons and their allies stonewalled, dodging subpoenas with claims of privilege. Undeterred, Walsh battled in Senate chambers, securing court orders to compel testimony and seize bank records. Each hard-won document, checks, wire transfers, tightened the noose around Fall's schemes. By late 1923, his relentless pursuit exposed a web of deceit, turning whispers into undeniable proof. At first, there was little to see. The Interior Department presented the leases as legal. The Navy raised no objections, and Fall had resigned citing health reasons. But Walsh had a hunch, and time was on his side. He subpoenaed documents, he summoned officials, he followed paper trails others had ignored. His investigation stretched over months, slowly peeling away the layers of secrecy. Then came the leak that changed everything. In April 1922, the Wall Street Journal published a bombshell expose revealing that Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company had secured the Teapot Dome lease without competitive bidding. The public reaction was swift and furious. Teapot Dome's 150 to 300 million barrels, worth up to $500 million, fueled outrage over its loss to private hands. Editorials condemned the apparent giveaway of vital national resources. Oilmen across the country bristled at what they now saw as a sweetheart deal designed to enrich political allies. Soon, other publications joined the chorus. From the Denver Post to the New York Times, newspapers fanned the flames of the scandal. The phrase Teapot Dome entered the American lexicon as shorthand for corruption. Walsh intensified his investigation. Through subpoenas and testimony, the pieces came together. First, he uncovered the $100,000 loan from Edward Doheny, hand-delivered in cash by Doheny's son to Fall's Washington apartment. The payment, though labeled a personal loan, came at the precise moment Pan American Petroleum secured its Elk Hills lease. Then came the flood of evidence implicating Harry Sinclair. Walsh discovered that Sinclair had bestowed Fall with an estimated $300,000 in cash, Liberty bonds, and cattle. Walsh's case grew stronger with each revelation. Fall's sudden wealth, the new cars, the refurbished ranch, the extravagant gifts, was no longer rumor. It was fact, documented and irrefutable. Public anger swelled into a storm. Navy officers, still resentful of Fall's seizure of the reserves, testified that the leases endangered national security. They argued that these reserves, once a last defense in wartime, had been sold off for personal profit. Even former Harding allies turned against the administration as the scandal dominated front pages. By October 1923, Walsh's public hearings reached their crescendo. Inside packed Senate committee rooms, the details spilled into the public domain. Bribes, leases, bank records, and personal favors all laid bare. But one man would not live to see the fallout. On August 2, 1923, President Warren Harding, exhausted from the mounting pressures of office and whispers of scandal, collapsed while visiting San Francisco. His death, attributed to a heart attack, spared him from direct accountability. But his administration, already teetering, plunged deeper into crisis. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, inherited a nation gripped by disgust. Newspapers published headlines linking Harding's death to Teapot Dome's unraveling. For the American public, it was clear. Corruption had seeped to the highest levels of government. The Department of Justice, under mounting political pressure, opened criminal investigations. A special prosecutor was appointed. Fall, Sinclair, and Doheny were now not just subjects of Senate inquiries, but targets of federal prosecution. For the first time in U.S. history, a former cabinet member official, Albert Fall, faced indictment for corruption. But the reckoning would not end there. The scandal had already begun reshaping the public's faith in government, sparking calls for reform and greater transparency. Teapot Dome was no longer just a Wyoming oil field. It had become the symbol of betrayal, and the trials were about to begin. The Senate's public hearings had captured the nation's attention, but for Albert Fall, Harry Sinclair, and Edward Doheny, the spectacle was far from over. In the cold, methodical hands of the Department of Justice, the Teapot Dome Scandal shifted from political theater to legal reckoning. In 1924, under the new administration of Calvin Coolidge, the Justice Department appointed Owen Roberts and Atlee Pomerine, two respected special prosecutors, to handle the high-profile cases. The task was monumental. Fall, Sinclair, and Doheny were all wealthy, well-connected, and armed with top-tier legal teams. But the evidence compiled by Senator Walsh and his investigators was damning. Albert Fall was the first cabinet official to face a criminal bribery trial. Prosecutors charged him with accepting bribes while in office, an unprecedented moment in American history. For the first time, a former cabinet official stood before a criminal court accused of selling out the public trust. The trial opened in 1927, drawing national press coverage. Fall, ever defiant, claimed the payments were personal loans from friends, unconnected to the leases, but jurors were not convinced. The paper trail was too clear, the timing too damning. That autumn, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Fall was sentenced to 1 year in prison and fined $100,000, the same amount Doheny had delivered in that infamous satchel of cash. The symbolism wasn't lost on the public. In July 1931, Fall reported to the New Mexico State Penitentiary, becoming the first cabinet member in U.S. history to serve time for crimes committed in office. But justice moved unevenly. Harry Sinclair, ever the showman, chose confrontation over contrition. He refused to cooperate with Senate subpoenas, openly defying Congress. In a bold and unprecedented act, Sinclair hired private detectives to shadow jury members during his trial, a brazen attempt to influence the outcome. When the scheme was exposed, Sinclair wasn't convicted of bribery. Instead, he was jailed for contempt of Congress and jury tampering. Though spared the harsher penalties Fall faced, Sinclair's reputation was irrevocably tarnished. His once mighty Mammoth Oil Company suffered massive financial and reputational blows, struggling to recover from the public backlash. Perhaps the most shocking twist came in the case of Edward Doheny. Despite the blatant evidence, the $100,000 cash delivery, the lease's favorable terms, Doheny was acquitted of bribery in 1930. His defense successfully argued that the loan was a personal transaction between old friends, unconnected to official duties. The verdict outraged the public, many of whom saw it as proof that the rich and powerful could still evade justice. Doheny's acquittal sparked fierce debates in Congress and the press, yet legally, he walked free. While criminal trials grabbed headlines, the battle for Teapot Dome itself played out in the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1927, the court ruled that the Teapot Dome leases obtained through fraud and corruption were null and void. Control of the oil fields was returned to the federal government. The ruling set a powerful legal precedent. No matter how ironclad the contracts, corruption at their core rendered them invalid. Sinclair and Doheny's dreams of long-term profits from the reserves evaporated overnight. Beyond the trials, Teapot Dome left a seismic impact on American governance. The scandal fueled public demands for stronger transparency and accountability in government contracting. Congress expanded its oversight powers, affirming its right to compel testimony and access documents from executive agencies. The episode inspired legislative reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses, including stricter regulations on leasing public lands and minerals. The scandal's fallout reshaped the law. Congress, stung by public fury, tightened the Mineral Leasing Act, mandating competitive bidding for public land leases. No longer could insiders like Fall broker secret deals. Transparency became the shield against greed. Stricter oversight ensured oil reserves served the nation, not private empires. These reforms, forged in Teapot Dome's crucible, stood as a barrier against corruption's return. Teapot Dome also became a cautionary tale in political discourse. For decades, the phrase would be invoked as the ultimate symbol of governmental betrayal, a reminder that even the highest offices were vulnerable to greed. Political cartoons, editorials, and textbooks immortalized Fall, Sinclair, and Doheny as the faces of corruption. Even President Harding, though never directly implicated in the leases, saw his historical reputation collapse under the weight of the scandal. His death in 1923 spared him from testifying, but his administration's image never recovered. Future administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, would cite Teapot Dome as the low watermark of political ethics, a legacy that haunted Washington well into the mid-20th century. In the American psyche, Teapot Dome became more than an oil scandal. It was a referendum on power, privilege, and fragile trust between the governed and those who govern. Albert Fall, once a proud son of the West, died in 1944, penniless and disgraced. Harry Sinclair returned to private life, never regaining his former status. Edward Doheny continued his business empire, but the stain of the scandal lingered. Yet for ordinary Americans, the lesson was indelible. Even in the land of laws, justice doesn't always move in straight lines, but in the end, corruption leaves a mark that no courtroom can fully erase.